Chapter 28. Petronius to Vinicius: Have pity, Carissime, imitate not in thy letters the Lacedaemonians or Julius Caesar. Couldst thou, like Julius, write Veni, Vidi, Vici, I came, I saw, I conquered, I might understand thy brevity. But thy letter means absolutely Veni, Vidi, Fuggi, I came, I saw, I fled. Since such a conclusion of the affair is directly opposed to thy nature, since thou art wounded, and since, finally, uncommon things are happening to thee, thy letter needs explanation. I could not believe my eyes when I read that the Lygian giant killed Croton as easily as a Caledonian dog would kill a wolf in the defiles of Hibernia. That man is worth as much gold as he himself weighs, and it depends on him alone to become a favorite of Caesar. When I return to the city, I must gain a nearer acquaintance with that Lygian, and have a bronze statue of him made for myself. Ahenobarbus will burst from curiosity, when I tell him that it is from nature. Bodies really athletic are becoming rarer in Italy and in Greece. Of the Orient no mention need be made. The Germans, though large, have muscles covered with fat, and are greater in bulk than in strength. Learn from the Lygian if he is an exception, or if in his country there are more men like him. Should it happen sometime to thee or me to organize games officially, it would be well to know where to seek for the best bodies. But praise to the gods of the Orient and the Occident that thou hast come out of such hands alive. Thou hast escaped, of course, because thou art a patrician, and the son of a consul, but everything which has happened astonishes me in the highest degree. That cemetery where thou wert among the Christians, their treatment of thee, the subsequent flight of Lygia, finally, that peculiar sadness and disquiet which breathes from thy short letter. Explain, for there are many points which I cannot understand, and if thou wish the truth, I will tell thee plainly, that I understand neither the Christians nor thee nor Lygia. Wonder not that I, who care for few things on earth except my own person, inquire of thee so eagerly. I have contributed to all this affair of thine, hence it is my affair so far. Write soon, for I cannot foresee surely when we may meet. In Bronzebeard's head plans change, as winds do in autumn. At present, while tarrying in Beneventum, he has the wish to go straight away to Greece, without returning to Rome. Tigellinus, however, advises him to visit the city even for a time, since the people, yearning overmuch for his person, greed for games and bread, may revolt. So I cannot tell how it will be. Should Achaia overbalance, we may want to see Egypt. I should insist with all my might on thy coming, for I think that in thy state of mind traveling and our amusements would be a medicine, but thou mightst not find us. Consider, then, whether in that case repose in thy Sicilian estates would not be preferable to remaining in Rome. Write me minutely of thyself, and farewell. I add no wish this time, except health, for, by Pollux, I know not what to wish thee. Vinicius, on receiving this letter, felt at first no desire to reply. He had a kind of feeling that it was not worth while to reply, that an answer would benefit no one in any way, that it would explain nothing. Discontent, and a feeling of the vanity of life, possessed him. He thought, moreover, that Petronius would not comprehend him in any case, and that something had happened which would remove them from each other. He could not come to an agreement with himself, even, when he returned from the Transtiber to his splendid insula. He was exhausted, and found for the first days a certain satisfaction in rest and in the comfort and abundance about him. That satisfaction lasted but a short time, however. He felt soon that he was living in vanity, that all which so far had formed the interest of his life either had ceased to exist for him or had shrunk to proportions barely perceptible. He had a feeling as if those ties which hitherto had connected him with life had been cut in his soul, and that no new ones had been formed. At the thought that he might go to Beneventum and thence to Achaia, to swim in a life of luxury and wild excess, he had a feeling of emptiness. To what end? What shall I gain from it? These were the first questions which passed through his head. And for the first time in life, also, he thought that if he went, the conversation of Petronius, his wit, his quickness, his exquisite outlining of thought, and his choice of apt phrases for every idea might annoy him. But solitude, too, had begun to annoy him. All his acquaintances were with Caesar and Beneventum, so he had to stay at home alone, with a head full of thoughts, and a heart full of feelings which he could not analyze. He had moments, however, in which he judged that if he could converse with someone about everything that took place in him, Perhaps he might be able to grasp it all somehow, bring it to order, and estimate it better. Under the influence of this hope, and after some days of hesitation, he decided to answer Petronius, and, though not certain that he would send the answer, he wrote it in the following words: "It is thy wish that I write more minutely. Agreed then. Whether I shall be able to do it more clearly, I cannot tell, for there are many knots which I know not myself how to loosen. I described to thee my stay among the Christians, and their treatment of enemies, among whom they had a right to count both me and Shiloh. Finally, of the kindness with which they nursed me, and of the disappearance of Ligia. No, my dear friend, I was not spared because of being the son of a consul. Such considerations do not exist for them, since they forgave even Shiloh, though I urged them to bury him in the garden. Those are people such as the world has not seen hitherto, and their teaching is of a kind that the world has not heard up to this time. I can say nothing else, and he errs who measures them with our measure. I tell thee that, if I had been lying with a broken arm in my own house, and if my own peoples, even my own family, had nursed me, I should have had more comforts, of course, but I should not have received half the care which I found among them. Know this, too, that Lygia is like the others. Had she been my sister or my wife, she could not have nursed me more tenderly. Delight filled my heart more than once, for I judged that love alone could inspire the like tenderness. More than once I saw love in her look, in her face, and, wilt thou believe me? Among those simple people then in that poor chamber, which was at once a Coolina and a triclinium, I felt happier than ever before. No, she was not indifferent to me, and today even I cannot think that she was. Still this same Lygia left Miriam's dwelling in secret because of me. I sit now whole days with my head on my hands, and think, why did she do so? Have I written thee that I volunteered to restore her to Alice? True, she declared that to be impossible at present, because Alice and Pomponia had gone to Sicily, and because news of her return going from house to house, through slaves, would reach the Palatine, and Caesar might take her from Alice again. But she knew that I would not pursue her longer, that I had left the way of violence, that, unable to cease loving her or to live without her, I would bring her into my house through a wreathed door, and seat her on a sacred skin at my hearth. Still she fled. Why? Nothing was threatening her. Did she not love me, she might have rejected me. The day before her flight, I made the acquaintance of a wonderful man, a certain Paul of Tarsus, who spoke to me of Christ and his teachings, and spoke with such power that every word of his, without his willing it, turns all the foundations of our society into ashes. That same man visited me after her flight, and said, if God open thy eyes to the light, and take the beam from them as he took it from mine, thou wilt feel that she acted properly, and then, perhaps, thou wilt find her. And now I am breaking my head over these words, as if I had heard them from the mouth of the Pythoness at Delphi. I seem to understand something. Though they love people, the Christians are enemies of our life, our gods, and our crimes. Hence she fled from me, as from a man who belongs to our society, and with whom she would have to share a life counted criminal by Christians. Thou wilt say that since she might reject me, she had no need to withdraw. But if she loved me, in that case she desired to flee from love. At the very thought of this I wished to send slaves into every alley in Rome, and command them to cry throughout the houses, return, Lygia. But I cease to understand why she fled. I should not have stopped her from believing in her Christ, and would myself have reared an altar to him in the atrium. What harm could one more God do me? Why might I not believe in him, I who do not believe overmuch in the old gods? I know with full certainty that the Christlings do not lie, and they say that he rose from the dead. A man cannot rise from the dead. That Paul of Tarsus, who is a Roman citizen, but who, as a Jew, knows the old Hebrew writings, told me that the coming of Christ was promised by prophets for whole thousands of years. All these are uncommon things, but does not the uncommon surround us on every side? People have not ceased talking yet of Apollonius of Tyana. Paul's statement that there is one God, not a whole assembly of them, seems sound to me. Perhaps Seneca is of this opinion, and before him many others. Christ lived, gave himself to be crucified for the salvation of the world, and rose from the dead. All this is perfectly certain. I do not see, therefore, a reason why I should insist on an opposite opinion, or why I should not rear to him an altar. If I am ready to rear one to Serapis, for instance, It would not be difficult for me even to renounce other gods, for no reasoning mind believes in them at present. But it seems that all of this is not enough yet for the Christians. It is not enough to honor Christ, one must also live according to his teachings. And here thou art on the shore of a sea which they command thee to wade through. If I promised to do so, they themselves would feel that the promise was an empty sound of words. Paul told me so openly. Thou knowest how I love Lygia, and knowest that there is nothing that I would not do for her. Still, even at her wish, I cannot raise Sirac or Vesuvius on my shoulders, or place Thrasymene Lake on the palm of my hand, or from black make my eyes blue, like those of the Lygians. If she so desired, I could have the wish, but the change does not lie in my power. I am not a philosopher, but also I am not so dull as I have seemed, perhaps, more than once to thee. I will state now the following. I know not how the Christians order their own lives, but I know that where their religion begins, Roman rule ends, Rome itself ends, our mode of life ends, the distinction between conquered and conqueror, between rich and poor, lord and slave, ends, government ends, Caesar ends, law and all the order of the world ends, and in place of those appear Christ, with a certain mercy not existent hitherto, and kindness, opposed to human and our Roman instincts. It is true that Lygia is more to me than all Rome and its lordship, and I would let society vanish could I have her in my house. But that is another thing. Agreement in words does not satisfy the Christians. A man must feel that their teaching is truth, and not have aught else in his soul. But that, the gods are my witnesses, is beyond me. Dost understand what that means? There is something in my nature which shudders at this religion, and were my lips to glorify it, were I to conform to its precepts, my soul and my reason would say that I do so through love for Lygia, and that apart from her there is to me nothing on earth more repulsive. And, a strange thing, Paul of Tarsus understands this, and so does that old Thurgus Peter, who in spite of all his simplicity and low origin is the highest among them, and was the disciple of Christ. And dost thou know what they are doing? They are praying for me, and calling down something which they call grace, but nothing descends on me, save disquiet, and a greater yearning for Lygia. I have written thee that she went away secretly, but when going she left me a cross which she put together from twigs of boxwood. When I woke up, I found it near my bed. I have it now in the Lorarium, and I approach it yet, I cannot tell why, as if there were something divine in it, that is, with awe and reverence. I love it because her hand bound it, and I hate it because it divides us. At times it seems to me that there are enchantments of some kind in all this affair, and that the Thurgus, Peter, though he declares himself to be a simple shepherd, is greater than Apollonius, and all who preceded him, and that he has involved us all, Lygia, Pomponia, and me with them. Thou hast written that in my previous letter disquiet and sadness are visible. Sadness there must be, for I have lost her again, and there is disquiet because something has changed in me. I tell thee sincerely, that nothing is more repugnant to my nature than that religion, and still I cannot recognize myself since I met Lygia. Is it enchantment, or love? Circe changed people's bodies by touching them, but my soul has been changed. No one but Lygia could have done that, or rather Lygia through that wonderful religion which she professes. When I returned to my house from the Christians, no one was waiting for me. The slaves thought that I was in Beneventum, and would not return soon, hence there was disorder in the house. I found the slaves drunk, and a feast, which they were giving themselves, in my triclinium. They had more thought of seeing death than me, and would have been less terrified by it. Thou knowest with what a firm hand I hold my house. All to the last one dropped on their knees, and some fainted from terror. But dost thou know how I acted? At the first moment I wished to call for rods and hot iron, but immediately a kind of shame seized me, and, wilt thou lend belief? A species of pity for those wretched people. Among them are old slaves whom my grandfather, Marcus Vinicius, brought from the Rhine in the time of Augustus. I shut myself up alone in the library, and there came stranger thoughts still to my head, namely, that after what I had heard and seen among the Christians, it did not become me to act with slaves as I had acted hitherto, that they too were people. For a number of days they moved about in mortal terror, in the belief that I was delaying so as to invent punishment the more cruel. But I did not punish, and did not punish because I was not able. Summoning them on the third day, I said, I forgive you. Strive then with earnest service to correct your fault. They fell on their knees, covering their faces with tears, stretching forth their hands with groans, and called me Lord and Father. But I with shame do I write this was equally moved. It seemed to me that at that moment I was looking at the sweet face of Lygia, and her eyes filled with tears, thanking me for that act. And, propudor, I felt that my lips too were moist. Dost know what I will confess to thee? This, that I cannot do without her, that it is ill for me alone, that I am simply unhappy, and that my sadness is greater than thou wilt admit. But, as to my slaves, one thing arrested my attention. The forgiveness which they received not only did not make them insolent, not only did not weaken discipline, but never had fear roused them to such ready service as has gratitude. Not only do they serve, but they seem to vie with one another to divine my wishes. I mention this to thee because, when, the day before I left the Christians, I told Paul that society would fall apart because of his religion, as a cask without hoops, he answered, "Love is a stronger hoop than fear." And now I see that in certain cases his opinion may be right. I have verified it also with references to clients, who, learning of my return, hurried to salute me. Thou knowest that I have never been penurious with them, but my father acted haughtily with clients on principle, and taught me to treat them in like manner. But when I saw their worn mantles and hungry faces, I had a feeling something like compassion. I gave command to bring them food, and conversed besides with them, called some by name, some I asked about their wives and children, and again in the eyes before me I saw tears. Again it seemed to me that Lygia saw what I was doing, that she praised and was delighted. Is my mind beginning to wander, or is love confusing my feelings? I cannot tell. But this I do know, I have a continual feeling that she is looking at me from a distance, and I am afraid to do aught that might trouble or offend her. So it is, Keys. But they have changed my soul, and sometimes I feel well for that reason. At times again I am tormented with the thought, for I fear that my manhood and energy are taken from me, that, perhaps, I am useless, not only for counsel, for judgment, for feasts, but for war even. These are undoubted enchantments. And to such a degree am I changed that I tell thee this, too, which came to my head when I lay wounded, that if Lygia were like Nigidia, Poppaea, Crispinilla, and our divorced women, if she were as vile, as pitiless, and as cheap as they, I should not love her as I do at present. But since I love her for that which divides us, thou wilt divine what a chaos is rising in my soul, in what darkness I live, how it is that I cannot see certain roads before me, and how far I am from knowing what to begin. If life may be compared to a spring, in my spring disquiet flows instead of water. I live through the hope that I shall see her, perhaps, and sometimes it seems to me that I shall see her surely. But what will happen to me in a year or 2 years, I know not, and cannot divine. I shall not leave Rome. I could not endure the society of the Augustines, and besides, the one solace in my sadness and disquiet is the thought that I am near Lygia, that through Glaucus the physician, who promised to visit me, or through Paul of Tarsus, I can learn something of her at times. No, I would not leave Rome, even were ye to offer me the government of Egypt. Know also, that I have ordered the sculptor to make a stone monument for Gulo, whom I slew in anger. Too late did it come to my mind that he had carried me in his arms, and was the first to teach me how to put an arrow on a bow. I know not why it was that a recollection of him rose in me which was sorrow and reproach. If what I write astonish thee, I reply that it astonishes me no less, but I write pure truth. Farewell. Chapter 29. Vinicius received no answer to this letter. Petronius did not write, thinking evidently that Caesar might command a return to Rome any day. In fact, news of it was spread in the city, and roused great delight in the hearts of the rabble, eager for games with gifts of grain and olives, great supplies of which had been accumulated in Ostia. Helius, Nero's freedman, announced at last their return in the Senate. But Nero, having embarked with his court on ships at Misenum, returned slowly, disembarking at coast towns for rest, or exhibitions in theaters. He remained between 10 and 20 days in Minturna, and even thought to return to Naples and wait there for spring, which was earlier than usual, and warm. During all this time Vinicius lived shut up in his house, thinking of Lygia, and all those new things which occupied his soul, and brought to it ideas and feelings foreign to it thus far. He saw, from time to time, only Glaucus the physician, every one of whose visits delighted him, for he could converse with the man about Lygia. Glaucus knew not, it is true, where she had found refuge, but he gave assurance that the elders were protecting her with watchful care. Once too, when moved by the sadness of Vinicius, he told him that Peter had blamed Crispus for reproaching Lygia with her love. The young patrician, hearing this, grew pale from emotion. He had thought more than once that Lygia was not indifferent to him, but he fell into frequent doubt and uncertainty. Now for the first time he heard the confirmation of his desires and hopes from strange lips, and, besides, those of a Christian. At the first moment of gratitude he wished to run to Peter. When he learned, however, that he was not in the city, but teaching in the neighborhood, he implored Glaucus to accompany him thither, promising to make liberal gifts to the poor community. It seemed to him, too, that if Lygia loved him, all obstacles were thereby set aside, as he was ready at any moment to honor Christ. Glaucus, though he urged him persistently to receive baptism, would not venture to assure him that he would gain Lygia at once, and said that it was necessary to desire the religion for its own sake, through love of Christ, not for other objects. One must have a Christian soul, too, said he. And Vinicius, though every obstacle angered him, had begun to understand that Glaucus, as a Christian, said what he ought to say. He had not become clearly conscious that one of the deepest changes in his nature was this, that formerly he had measured people and things only by his own selfishness, but now he was accustoming himself gradually to the thought that other eyes might see differently, other hearts feel differently, and that justice did not mean always the same as personal profit. He wished often to see Paul of Tarsus, whose discourse made him curious and disturbed him. He arranged in his mind arguments to overthrow his teaching. He resisted him in thought, still he wished to see him and to hear him. Paul, however, had gone to Aricium, and, since the visits of Glaucus had become rarer, Vinicius was in perfect solitude. He began again to run through back streets adjoining the Subura, and narrow lanes of the Trans-Tiber, in the hope that even from a distance he might see Lygia. When even that hope failed him, weariness and impatience began to rise in his heart. At last the time came when his former nature was felt again mightily, like that onrush of a wave to the shore from which it had receded. It seemed to him that he had been a fool to no purpose, that he had stuffed his head with things which brought sadness, that he ought to accept from life what it gives. He resolved to forget Lygia, or at least to seek pleasure in the use of things aside from her. He felt that this trial, however, was the last, and he threw himself into it with all the blind energy of impulse peculiar to him. Life itself seemed to urge him to this course. The Appian Way. From the painting by G. Boulanger, the city, torpid and depopulated by winter, began to revive with hope of the near coming of Caesar. A solemn reception was in waiting for him. Meanwhile spring was there. The snow on the Alban hills had vanished under the breath of winds from Africa. Grass plots in the gardens were covered with violets. The forums and the Campus Martius were filled with people warmed by a sun of growing heat. Along the Appian Way, the usual place for drives outside the city, a movement of richly ornamented chariots had begun. Excursions were made to the Alban hills. Youthful women, under pretext of worshipping Juno in Lanuvium, or Diana in Aricia, left home to seek adventures, society, meetings, and pleasure beyond the city. Here Vinicius saw one day among lordly chariots the splendid car of Chrysothemis, preceded by 2 Molossian dogs. It was surrounded by a crowd of young men and by old senators, whose position detained them in the city. Chrysothemis, driving 4 Corsican ponies herself, scattered smiles round about, and light strokes of a golden whip, but when she saw Vinicius she reined in her horses, took him into her car, and then to a feast at her house, which lasted all night. At that feast Vinicius drank so much that he did not remember when they took him home. He recollected, however, that when Chrysothemis mentioned Lygia he was offended, and, being drunk, emptied a goblet of Falernian on her head. When he thought of this in soberness, he was angrier still. But a day later Chrysothemis, forgetting evidently the injury, visited him at his house, and took him to the Appian Way a second time. Then she supped at his house, and confessed that not only Petronius, but his lute player, had grown tedious to her long since, and that her heart was free now. They appeared together for a week, but the relation did not promise permanence. After the Falernian incident, however, Lygia's name was never mentioned, but Vinicius could not free himself from thoughts of her. He had the feeling always that her eyes were looking at his face, and that feeling filled him, as it were, with fear. He suffered, and could not escape the thought that he was saddening Lygia, or the regret which that thought roused in him. After the first scene of jealousy which Chrysothemis made because of 2 Syrian damsels whom he purchased, he let her go in rude fashion. He did not cease at once from pleasure and license, it is true, but he followed them out of spite, as it were, toward Ligia. At last he saw that the thought of her did not leave him for an instant, that she was the one cause of his evil activity as well as his good, and that really nothing in the world occupied him except her. Disgust, and then weariness, mastered him. Pleasure had grown loathsome, and left mere reproaches. It seemed to him that he was wretched, and this last feeling filled him with measureless astonishment, for formerly he recognized as good everything which pleased him. Finally, he lost freedom, self-confidence, and fell into perfect torpidity, from which even the news of Caesar's coming could not rouse him. Nothing touched him, and he did not visit Petronius till the latter sent an invitation and his litter. On seeing his uncle, though greeted with gladness, he replied to his questions unwillingly, but his feelings and thoughts, repressed for a long time, burst forth at last, and flowed from his mouth in a torrent of words. Once more he told in detail the history of his search for Lygia, his life among the Christians, everything which he had heard and seen there, everything which had passed through his head and heart, and finally he complained that he had fallen into a chaos, in which were lost composure and the gift of distinguishing and judging. Nothing, he said, attracted him, nothing was pleasing, he did not know what to hold to, nor how to act. He was ready both to honor and persecute Christ, he understood the loftiness of his teaching, but he felt also an irresistible repugnance to it. He understood that, even should he possess Lygia, he would not possess her completely, for he would have to share her with Christ. Finally, he was living as if not living, without hope, without a morrow, without belief and happiness. Around him was darkness in which he was groping for an exit, and could not find it. Petronius, during this narrative, looked at his changed face, at his hands, which while speaking he stretched forth in a strange manner, as if actually seeking a road in the darkness, and he fell to thinking. All at once he rose, and, approaching Vinicius, caught with his fingers the hair above his ear. "Dost know," asked he, "that thou hast gray hairs on thy temple?" "Perhaps I have," answered Vinicius. "I should not be astonished were all my hair to grow white soon." Silence followed. Petronius was a man of sense, and more than once he meditated on the soul of man and on life. In general, life, in the society in which they both lived, might be happy or unhappy externally, but internally it was at rest. Just as a thunderbolt or an earthquake might overturn a temple, so might misfortune crush a life. In itself, however, it was composed of simple and harmonious lines, free of complication. But there was something else in the words of Vinicius, and Petronius stood for the first time before a series of spiritual snarls which no one had straightened out hitherto. He was sufficiently a man of reason to feel their importance, but with all his quickness he could not answer the questions put to him. After a long silence, he said at last, "These must be enchantments." "I too have thought so," answered Vinicius. "More than once it seemed to me that we were enchanted, both of us." "And if thou," said Petronius, "were to go, for example, to the priests of Serapis?" "Among them, as among priests in general, there are many deceivers, no doubt, but there are others who have reached wonderful secrets." He said this, however, without conviction and with an uncertain voice, for he himself felt how empty and even ridiculous that counsel must seem on his lips. Vinicius rubbed his forehead, and said, "Enchantments. I have seen sorcerers who employed unknown and subterranean powers to their personal profit. I have seen those who use them to the harm of their enemies. But these Christians live in poverty, forgive their enemies, preach submission, virtue, and mercy. What profit could they get from enchantments, and why should they use them?" Petronius was angry that his acuteness could find no reply. Not wishing, however, to acknowledge this, he said, so as to offer an answer of some kind, "That is a new sect." After a while he added, "By the divine dweller in Paphian groves, how all that injures life. Thou wilt admire the goodness and virtue of those people, but I tell thee that they are bad, for they are enemies of life, as are diseases, and death itself. As things are, We have enough of these enemies, we do not need the Christians in addition. Just count them: diseases, Caesar, Tigellinus, Caesar's poetry, cobblers who govern the descendants of ancient Quirites, freedmen who sit in the Senate. By Castor, there is enough of this. That is a destructive and disgusting sect. Hast thou tried to shake thyself out of this sadness, and make some little use of life? I have tried, answered Vinicius. Ah, traitor, said Petronius, laughing, news spreads quickly through slaves. Thou hast seduced from me Chrysothemis. Vinicius waved his hand in disgust. In every case I thank thee, said Petronius. I will send her a pair of slippers embroidered with pearls. In my language of a lover that means, walk away. I owe thee a double gratitude. First, thou didst not accept Eunice. Second, thou hast freed me from Chrysothemis. Listen to me. Thou settest before thee a man who has risen early, bathed, feasted, possessed Chrysothemis, written satires, and even at times interwoven prose with verses, but who has been as wearied as Caesar, and often unable to unfetter himself from gloomy thoughts. And dost thou know why that was so? It was because I sought at a distance that which was near. A beautiful woman is worth her weight always in gold, but if she loves in addition, she has simply no price. Such a one thou wilt not buy with the riches of Verres. I say now to myself as follows: I will fill my life with happiness, as a goblet with the foremost wine which the earth has produced, and I will drink till my hand becomes powerless and my lips grow pale. What will come, I care not, and this is my latest philosophy. Thou hast proclaimed it always, there is nothing new in it. There is substance, which was lacking. When he had said this, he called Eunice, who entered dressed in white drapery, the former slave no longer, but as it were a goddess of love and happiness. Petronius opened his arms to her, and said, Come. At this she ran up to him, and, sitting on his knee, surrounded his neck with her arms, and placed her head on his breast. Vinicius saw how a reflection of purple began to cover her cheeks, how her eyes melted gradually in mist. They formed a wonderful group of love and happiness. Petronius stretched his hand to a flat vase standing at one side on a table, and, taking a whole handful of violets, covered with them the head, bosom, and robe of Eunice. Then he pushed the tunic from her arms, and said, Happy he who, like me, has found love enclosed in such a form. At times it seems to me that we are a pair of gods. Look thyself. Has Praxiteles, or Meron, or Scopas, or Lysias even, created more wonderful lines? Or does there exist in Paros or in Pentelicus such marble as this, warm, rosy, and full of love? There are people who kiss off the edges of vases, but I prefer to look for pleasure where it may be found really. He began to pass his lips along her shoulders and neck. She was penetrated with a quivering, her eyes now closed, now opened, with an expression of unspeakable delight. Petronius after a while raised her exquisite head, and said, turning to Vinicius, But think now, what are thy gloomy Christians in comparison with this? And if thou understand not the difference, go thy way to them. But this sight will cure thee. Vinicius distended his nostrils, through which entered the odor of violets, which filled the whole chamber, and he grew pale, for he thought that if he could have passed his lips along Lygia's shoulders in that way, it would have been a kind of sacrilegious delight so great that let the world vanish afterward. But accustomed now to a quick perception of that which took place in him, he noticed that at that moment he was thinking of Lygia, and of her only. Eunice, said Petronius, give command, thou divine one, to prepare garlands for our heads and a meal. When she had gone out he turned to Vinicius. I offered to make her free, but knowest thou what she answered? I would rather be thy slave than Caesar's wife. And she would not consent. I freed her then without her knowledge. The praetor favored me by not requiring her presence. But she does not know that she is free, as also she does not know that this house and all my jewels, excepting the gems, will belong to her in case of my death. He rose and walked through the room, and said, Love changes some more, others less, but it has changed even me. Once I loved the odor of verbenas, but as Eunice prefers violets, I like them now beyond all other flowers, and since spring came we breathe only violets. Here he stopped before Vinicius and inquired, But as to thee, dost thou keep always to nard? Give me peace, answered the young man. I wished thee to see Eunice, and I mentioned her to thee, because thou, perhaps, art seeking also at a distance that which is near. Maybe for thee too is beating, somewhere in the chambers of thy slaves, a true and simple heart. Apply such a balsam to thy wounds. Thou sayest that Ligia loves thee? Perhaps she does. But what kind of love is that which abdicates? Is not the meaning this, that there is another force stronger than her love? No, my dear, Ligia is not Eunice. All is one torment merely, answered Vinicius. I saw thee kissing Eunice's shoulders, and I thought then that if Ligia would lay hers bare to me I should not care if the ground opened under us next moment. But at the very thought of such an act a certain dread seized me, as if I had attacked some vestal or wished to defile a divinity. Ligia is not Eunice, but I understand the difference not in thy way. Love has changed thy nostrils, and thou preferest violets to verbenas, but it has changed my soul. Hence, in spite of my misery and desire, I prefer Ligia to be what she is rather than to be like others. In that case no injustice is done thee. But I do not understand the position. True, true, answered Vinicius, feverishly. We understand each other no longer. Another moment of silence followed. May Hades swallow thy Christians, exclaimed Petronius. They have filled thee with disquiet, and destroyed thy sense of life. May Hades devour them. Thou art mistaken in thinking that their religion is good, for good is what gives people happiness, namely, beauty, love, power, but these they call vanity. Thou art mistaken in this, that they are just, for if we pay good for evil, what shall we pay for good? And besides, if we pay the same for one and the other, why are people to be good? No, the pay is not the same, but according to their teaching it begins in a future life, which is without limit. I do not enter into that question, for we shall see hereafter if it be possible to see anything without ties. Meanwhile they are simply incompetents. Ursus strangled Croton because he has limbs of bronze, but these are mopes, and the future cannot belong to mopes. For them life begins with death, which is as if one were to say, day begins with night. Hast thou the intent to carry off Ligia? No, I cannot pay her evil for good, and I swore that I would not. Dost thou intend to accept the religion of Christ? I wish to do so, but my nature cannot endure it. But wilt thou be able to forget Ligia? No. Then travel. At that moment the slaves announced that the repast was ready, but Petronius, to whom it seemed that he had fallen on a good thought, said, on the way to the triclinium, thou hast ridden over a part of the world, but only as a soldier hastening to his place of destination, and without halting by the way. Go with us to Achaia. Caesar has not given up the journey. He will stop everywhere on the way, sing, receive crowns, plunder temples, and return as a triumphator to Italy. That will resemble somewhat a journey of Bacchus and Apollo in one person. Augustines, male and female, 1,000th there. By Castor. That will be worth witnessing, for hitherto the world has not seen anything like it. Here he placed himself on the couch before the table, by the side of Eunice, and when the slaves put a wreath of anemones on his head, he continued, What hast thou seen in Corbulo's service? Nothing. Hast thou seen the Grecian temples thoroughly, as I have, I who was passing more than 2 years from the hands of one guide to those of another? Hast thou been in Rhodes to examine the site of the Colossus? Hast thou seen in Panopus, in Phocis, the clay from which Prometheus shaped man, or in Sparta the eggs laid by Leda, or in Athens the famous Sarmatian armor made of horse hooves, or in Euboea the ship of Agamemnon, or the cup for whose pattern the left breast of Helen served? Hast thou seen Alexandria, Memphis, the pyramids, the hair which Isis tore from her head in grief for Osiris? Hast thou heard the shout of Memnon? The world is wide, everything does not end at the Trans-Tiber. I will accompany Caesar, and when he returns I will leave him and go to Cyprus. For it is the wish of this golden-haired goddess of mine that we offer doves together to the divinity in Paphos, and thou must know that whatever she wishes must happen. I am thy slave, said Eunice. He rested his garlanded head on her bosom, and said with a smile, Then I am the slave of a slave. I admire thee, divine one, from feet to head. Then he said to Vinicius, Come with us to Cyprus. But first remember that thou must see Caesar. It is bad that thou hast not been with him yet. Tigellinus is ready to use this to thy disadvantage. He has no personal hatred for thee, it is true, but he cannot love thee, even because thou art my sister's son. We shall say that thou wert sick. We must think over what thou art to answer should he ask thee about Ligia. It will be best to wave thy hand and say that she was with thee till she wearied thee. He will understand that. Tell him also that sickness kept thee at home, that thy fever was increased by disappointment at not being able to visit Naples and hear his song, that thou wert assisted to health only by the hope of hearing him. Fear no exaggeration. Tigellinus promises to invent, not only something great for Caesar, but something enormous. I am afraid that he will undermine me. I am afraid too of thy disposition. Dost thou know, said Vinicius, that there are people who have no fear of Caesar, and who live as calmly as if he were non-existent? I know whom thou hast in mind, the Christians. Yes, they alone. But our life, what is it if not unbroken terror? Do not mention thy Christians. They fear not Caesar, because he has not even heard of them perhaps, and in every case he knows nothing of them, and they concern him as much as withered leaves. But I tell thee that they are incompetents. Thou feelest this thyself. If thy nature is repugnant to their teaching, it is just because thou feelest their incompetence. Thou art a man of other clay, so trouble not thyself or me with them. We shall be able to live and die, and what more they will be able to do is unknown. These words struck Vinicius, and when he returned home, he began to think that in truth, perhaps, the goodness and charity of Christians was a proof of their incompetence of soul. It seemed to him that people of strength and temper could not forgive thus. It came to his head that this must be the real cause of the repulsion which his Roman soul felt toward their teaching. We shall be able to live and die, said Petronius. As to them, they know only how to forgive, and understand neither true love nor true hatred. Chapter 30. Caesar, on returning to Rome, was angry because he had returned, and after some days was filled anew with a wish to visit Achaia. He even issued an edict in which he declared that his absence would be short, and that public affairs would not be exposed to detriment because of it. In company with Augustines, among whom was Vinicius, he repaired to the capital to make offerings to the gods for an auspicious journey. But on the second day, when he visited the temple of Vesta, an event took place which changed all his projects. Nero feared the gods, though he did not believe in them. He feared especially the mysterious Vesta, who filled him with such awe that at sight of the divinity and the sacred fire his hair rose on a sudden from terror, his teeth chattered, a shiver ran through his limbs, and he dropped into the arms of Vinicius, who happened there behind him. He was borne out of the temple at once, and conveyed to the Palatine, where he recovered soon, but did not leave the bed for that day. He declared, moreover, to the great astonishment of those present, that he deferred his journey, since the divinity had warned him secretly against haste. An hour later it was announced throughout Rome that Caesar, seeing the gloomy faces of the citizens, and moved by love for them, as a father for his children, would remain to share their lot and their pleasures. The people, rejoiced at this decision, and certain also that they would not miss games and a distribution of wheat, assembled in crowds before the gates of the Palatine, and raised shouts in honor of the divine Caesar, who interrupted the play at dice with which he was amusing himself with Augustines, and said, yes, there was need to defer the journey. Egypt, and predicted dominion over the Orient, cannot escape me. Hence Achaia, too, will not be lost. I will give command to cut through the Isthmus of Corinth. I will rear such monuments in Egypt that the pyramids will seem childish toys in comparison. I will have a sphinx built 7 times greater than that which is gazing into the desert outside Memphis, but I will command that it have my face. Coming ages will speak only of that monument and of me. With thy verses thou hast reared a monument to thyself already, not 7, but thrice 7 times greater than the pyramid of Cheops, said Petronius. But with my song? Inquired Nero. Ah, if men could only build for thee a statue, like that of Memnon, to call with thy voice at sunrise. For all ages to come the seas adjoining Egypt would swarm with ships in which crowds from the 3 parts of the world would be lost in listening to thy song. Alas, who can do that? Said Nero. But thou canst give command to cut out of basalt thyself driving the quadriga. True. I will do that. Thou wilt bestow a gift on humanity. In Egypt I will marry the moon, who is now a widow, and I shall be a god really. And thou wilt give us stars for wives. We will make a new constellation, which will be called the constellation of Nero. But do thou marry Vilius to the Nile, so that he may beget hippopotamuses. Give the desert to Tigellinus, he will be king of the jackals. And what dost thou predestine to me? Inquired Vadinius. Apis bless thee. Thou didst arrange such splendid games in beneventum that I cannot wish thee ill. Make a pair of boots for the Sphinx, whose paws must grow numb during night dews. After that thou wilt make sandals for the colossi which form the alleys before the temples. Each one will find there a fitting occupation. Domitius Offair, for example, will be treasurer, since he is known for his honesty. I am glad, Caesar, when thou art dreaming of Egypt, and I am saddened because thou hast deferred thy plan of a journey. Thy mortal eyes saw nothing, for the deity becomes invisible to whomever it wishes, said Nero. Know that when I was in the temple of Vesta she herself stood near me, and whispered in my ear, defer the journey. That happened so unexpectedly that I was terrified, though for such an evident care of the gods for me I should be thankful. We were all terrified, said Tigellinus, and the Vestal Rubria fainted. Rubria, said Nero, what a snowy neck she has. But she blushed at sight of the divine Caesar. True. I noticed that myself. That is wonderful. There is something divine in every Vestal, and Rubria is very beautiful. Tell me, said he, after a moment's meditation, why people fear Vesta more than other gods. What does this mean? Though I am the chief priest, fear seized me today. I remember only that I was falling back, and should have dropped to the ground had not someone supported me. Who is it? I, answered Vinicius. Oh, thou stern Mars, why wert thou not in beneventum? They told me that thou wert ill, and indeed thy face is changed. But I heard that Croton wished to kill thee. Is that true? It is, and he broke my arm, but I defended myself. With a broken arm? A certain barbarian helped me. He was stronger than Croton. Nero looked at him with astonishment. Stronger than Croton? Art thou jesting? Croton was the strongest of men. But now here is Syphax from Ethiopia. I tell thee, Caesar, what I saw with my own eyes. Where is that pearl? Has he not become king of Nemi? I cannot tell, Caesar. I lost sight of him. Thou knowest not even of what people he is? I had a broken arm, and could not inquire for him. Seek him, and find him for me. I will occupy myself with that, said Tigellinus. But Nero spoke further to Vinicius. I thank thee for having supported me. I might have broken my head by a fall. On a time thou wert a good companion, but campaigning in service with Corbulo have made thee wild in some way. I see thee rarely. How is that maiden too narrow in the hips, with whom thou wert in love? Asked he after a while, and whom I took from malice for thee. Vinicius was confused, but Petronius came to his aid at that moment. I will lay a wager, Lord, said he, that he has forgotten. Dost thou see his confusion? Ask him how many of them there were since that time, and I will not give assurance of his power to answer. The Vinicius are good soldiers, but still better gamecocks. They need whole flocks. Punish him for that, Lord, by not inviting him to the feast which Tigellinus promises to arrange in thy honor on the pond of Agrippa. I will not do that. I trust, Tigellinus, that flocks of beauty will not be lacking there. Could the graces be absent where more will be present? Answered Tigellinus. Weariness tortures me, said Nero. I have remained in Rome at the will of the goddess, but I cannot endure the city. I will go to Antium. I am stifled in these narrow streets, amid these tumble-down houses, amid these alleys. Foul air flies even here to my house and my gardens. Oh, if an earthquake would destroy Rome, if some angry god would level it to the earth, I would show how a city should be built, which is the head of the world and my capital. Caesar, answered Tigellinus, thou sayest, if some angry god would destroy the city, is it so? It is. What then? But art thou not a god? Nero waved his hand with an expression of weariness, and said, we shall see thy work on the pond of Agrippa. Afterward I go to Antium. Ye are all little, hence do not understand that I need immense things. Then he closed his eyes, giving to understand in that way that he needed rest. In fact, the Augustines were beginning to depart. Petronius went out with Vinicius, and said to him, thou art invited, then, to share in the amusement. Bronzebeard has renounced the journey, but he will be madder than ever. He has fixed himself in the city as in his own house. Try thou, too, to find in these madnesses amusement and forgetfulness. Well, we have conquered the world, and have a right to amuse ourselves. Thou, Marcus, art a very comely fellow, and to that I ascribe in part the weakness which I have for thee. By the Ephesian Diana, if thou couldst see thy joined brows, and thy face in which the ancient blood of the Quirites is evident. Others near thee looked like freedmen. True. Were it not for that mad religion, Lygia would be in thy house today. Attempt once more to prove to me that they are not enemies of life and mankind. They have acted well toward thee, hence thou mayst be grateful to them, but in thy place I should detest that religion, and seek pleasure where I could find it. Thou art a comely fellow, I repeat, and Rome is swarming with divorced women. I wonder only that all this does not torture thee yet. Who has told thee that it does not? It tortures me this long time, but I am not of thy years. Besides, I have other attachments which are lacking thee. I love books, thou hast no love for them. I love poetry, which annoys thee. I love pottery, gems, a multitude of things, at which thou dost not look. I have a pain in my loins, which thou hast not, and, finally, I have found Eunice, but thou hast found nothing similar. For me, it is pleasant in my house, among masterpieces. Of thee I can never make a man of aesthetic feeling. I know that in life I shall never find anything beyond what I have found. Thou thyself knowest not that thou art hoping yet continually, and seeking. If death were to visit thee, with all thy courage and sadness, thou wouldst die with astonishment that it was necessary to leave the world, but I should accept death as a necessity, with the conviction that there is no fruit in the world which I have not tasted. I do not hurry, neither shall I loiter. I shall try merely to be joyful to the end. There are cheerful skeptics in the world. For me, the Stoics are fools, but Stoicism tempers men, at least, while thy Christians bring sadness into the world, which in life is the same as rain in nature. Dost thou know what I have learned? That during the festivities which Tigellinus will arrange at the pond of Agrippa, there will be lupainaria, and in them women from the first houses of Rome. Will there be not even one sufficiently beautiful to console thee? There will be maidens, too, appearing in society for the first Timaeus nymphs. Such is our Roman Caesardom. The air is mild already, the midday breeze will warm the water and not bring pimples on naked bodies. And thou, Narcissus, know this, that there will not be one to refuse thee, not one, even though she be a Vestal virgin. Vinicius began to strike his head with his palm, like a man occupied eternally with one thought. I should need luck to find such a one. And who did this for thee, if not the Christians? But people whose standard is a cross cannot be different. Listen to me. Greece was beautiful, and created wisdom. We created power. And what, to thy thinking, can this teaching create? If thou know, explain, for, by Pollux, I cannot divine it. Thou art afraid, it seems, lest I become a Christian, said Vinicius, shrugging his shoulders. I am afraid that thou hast spoiled life for thyself. If thou canst not be a Grecian, be a Roman, possess and enjoy. Our madnesses have a certain sense, for there is in them a kind of thought of our own. I despise Bronzebeard, because he is a Greek buffoon. If he held himself a Roman, I should recognize that he was right in permitting himself madness. Promise me that if thou find some Christian on returning home, thou wilt show thy tongue to him. If he be Glaucus the physician, he will not wonder. Till we meet on the pond of Agrippa. Chapter 31. Praetorians surrounded the groves on the banks of the pond of Agrippa, lest over numerous throngs of spectators might annoy Caesar and his guests. Though it was said that everything in Rome distinguished for wealth, beauty, or intellect was present at that feast, which had no equal in the history of the city. Tigellinus wished to recompense Caesar for the deferred journey to Achaia, to surpass all who had ever feasted Nero, and prove that no man could entertain as he could. With this object in view, while with Caesar in Naples, and later in Beneventum, he had made preparations and sent orders to bring from the remotest regions of the earth beasts, birds, rare fish, and plants, not omitting vessels and cloths, which were to enhance the splendor of the feast. The revenues of whole provinces went to satisfy mad projects, but the powerful favorite had no need to hesitate. His influence grew daily. Tigellinus was not dearer than others to Nero yet, perhaps, but he was becoming more and more indispensable. Petronius surpassed him infinitely in polish, intellect, wit. In conversation he knew better how to amuse Caesar, but to his misfortune he surpassed in conversation Caesar himself, hence he roused his jealousy. Moreover, he could not be an obedient instrument in everything, and Caesar feared his opinion when there were questions in matters of taste. But before Tigellinus, Nero never felt any restraint. The very title, arbiter elegantiarum, which had been given to Petronius, annoyed Nero's vanity, for who had the right to bear that title but himself? Tigellinus had sense enough to know his own deficiencies, and seeing that he could not compete with Petronius, Lucan, or others distinguished by birth, talents, or learning, he resolved to extinguish them by the suppleness of his services, and above all by such a magnificence that the imagination of Nero himself would be struck by it. He had arranged to give their feast on a gigantic raft, framed of gilded timbers. The borders of this raft were decked with splendid shells found in the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, shells brilliant with the colors of pearls and the rainbow. The banks of the pond were covered with groups of palm, with groves of lotus, and blooming roses. In the midst of these were hidden fountains of perfumed water, statues of gods and goddesses, and gold or silver cages filled with birds of various colors. In the center of the raft rose an immense tent, or rather, not to hide the feasters, only the roof of a tent, made of Syrian purple, resting on silver columns. Under it were gleaming, like suns, tables prepared for the guests, loaded with Alexandrian glass, crystal, and vessels simply beyond price, the plunder of Italy, Greece, and Asia Minor. The raft, which because of plants accumulated on it had the appearance of an island and a garden, was joined by cords of gold and purple to boats shaped like fish, swans, mews, and flamingos, in which sat at painted oars naked rowers of both sexes, with forms and features of marvelous beauty, their hair dressed in oriental fashion, or gathered in golden nets. When Nero arrived at the main raft with Poppaea and the Augustines, and sat beneath the purple tent roof, the oars struck the water, the boats moved, the golden cord stretched, and the raft with the feast and the guests began to move and describe circles on the pond. Other boats surrounded it, and other smaller rafts, filled with women playing on zither and harps, women whose rosy bodies on the blue background of the sky and the water and in the reflections from golden instruments seemed to absorb that blue and those reflections, and to change and bloom like flowers. From the groves at the banks, from fantastic buildings reared for that day and hidden among thickets, were heard music and song. The neighborhood resounded, the groves resounded, echoes bore around the voices of horns and trumpets. Caesar himself, with Poppaea on one side of him, and Pythagoras on the other, was amazed, and more especially when among the boats young slave maidens appeared as sirens, and were covered with green network in imitation of scales. He did not spare praises on Tigellinus, but he looked at Petronius from habit, wishing to learn the opinion of the arbiter, who seemed indifferent for a long time, and only when questioned outright, answered, "I judge, Lord, that 10,000 naked maidens make less impression than one." But the floating feast pleased Caesar, for it was something new. Besides, such exquisite dishes were served that the imagination of Apicius would have failed at sight of them, and wines of so many kinds that Otho, who used to serve 80, would have hidden under water with shame, could he have witnessed the luxury of that feast. Besides women, the Augustines sat down at the table, among whom Vinicius excelled all with his beauty. Formerly his figure and face indicated too clearly the soldier by profession, now mental suffering and the physical pain through which he had passed had chiseled his features, as if the delicate hand of a master had passed over them. His complexion had lost its former swarthiness, but the yellowish gleam of Numidian marble remained on it. His eyes had grown larger and more pensive. His body had retained its former powerful outlines, as if created for armor, but above the body of a legionary was seen the head of a Grecian god, or at least of a refined patrician, at once subtle and splendid. Petronius, in saying that none of the ladies of Caesar's court would be able or willing to resist Vinicius, spoke like a man of experience. All gazed at him now, not excepting Poppaea, or the Vestal Virgin Rubria, whom Caesar wished to see at the feast. Wines, cooled in mountain snow, soon warmed the hearts and heads of the guests. Boats shaped as grasshoppers or butterflies shot forth from the bushes at the shore every moment. The blue surface of the pond seemed occupied by butterflies. Above the boats here and there flew doves, and other birds from India and Africa, fastened with silver and blue threads or strings. The sun had passed the greater part of the sky, but the day was warm and even hot, though in the beginning of May. The pond heaved from the strokes of oars, which beat the water in time with music, but in the air there was not the least breath of wind. The groves were motionless, as if lost in listening and in gazing at that which was happening on the water. The raft circled continually on the pond, bearing guests who were increasingly drunk and boisterous. The feast had not run half its course yet, when the order in which all sat at the table was observed no longer. Caesar gave the example, for, rising himself, he commanded Vinicius, who sat next to Rubria the Vestal, to move. Nero occupied the place, and began to whisper something in Rubria's ear. Vinicius found himself next to Poppaea, who extended her arm and begged him to fasten her loosened bracelet. When he did so, with hands trembling somewhat, she cast at him from beneath her long lashes a glance as it were of modesty, and shook her golden head as if in resistance. Meanwhile the sun, growing larger, ruddier, sank slowly behind the tops of the grove. The guests were for the greater part thoroughly intoxicated. The raft circled now nearer the shore, on which, among bunches of trees and flowers, were seen groups of people, disguised as fauns or satyrs, playing on flutes, bagpipes, and drums, with groups of maidens representing nymphs, dryads, and hamadryads. Darkness fell at last amid drunken shouts from the tent, shouts raised in honor of Luna. Meanwhile the groves were lighted with 1,000 lamps. From the Eupane area on the shore shone swarms of lights. On the terraces appeared new naked groups, formed of the wives and daughters of the first Roman houses. These with voice and unrestrained manner began to lure partners. The raft touched the shore at last. Caesar and the Augustines vanished in the groves, scattered in the Eupane area, in tents hidden in thickets, in grottos artificially arranged among fountains and springs. Madness seized all. No one knew whither Caesar had gone. No one knew who was a senator, who a knight, who a dancer, who a musician. Satyrs and fauns fell to chasing nymphs with shouting. They struck lamps with thyrses to quench them. Darkness covered certain parts of the grove. Everywhere, however, laughter and shouts were heard, and whispers, and panting breaths. In fact, Rome had not seen anything like that before. Vinicius was not drunk, as he had been at the feast in Nero's palace, when Lygia was present, but he was roused and intoxicated by the sight of everything done round about, and at last the fever of pleasure seized him. Rushing into the forest, he ran, with others, examining who of the dryads seemed most beautiful. New flocks of these raced around him every moment with shouts and with songs. These flocks were pursued by fauns, satyrs, senators, knights, and by sounds of music. Seeing at last a band of maidens led by one arrayed as Diana, he sprang to it, intending to examine the goddess more closely. All at once the heart sank in his bosom, for he thought that in that goddess, with the moon on her forehead, he recognized Lygia. They encircled him with a mad whirl, and, wishing evidently to incline him to follow, rushed away the next moment like a herd of deer. But he stood on the spot with beating heart, breathless, for though he saw that the Diana was not Lygia, and that at close sight she was not even like her, the too powerful impression deprived him of strength. Straightway he was seized by such yearning as he had never felt before, and love for Lygia rushed to his breast in a new, immense wave. Never had she seemed so dear, pure, and beloved as in that forest of madness and frenzied excess. A moment before, he himself wished to drink of that cup, and share in that shameless letting loose of the senses. Now disgust and repugnance possessed him. He felt that infamy was stifling him, that his breast needed air and the stars which were hidden by the thickets of that dreadful grove. He determined to flee, but barely had he moved when before him stood some veiled figure, which placed its hands on his shoulders and whispered, flooding his face with burning breath, "I love thee. Come, no one will see us, hasten." Vinicius was roused, as if from a dream. "Who art thou?" But she leaned her breast on him and insisted, "Hurry. See how lonely it is here, and I love thee." "Come." "Who art thou?" repeated Vinicius. "Guess." As she said this, she pressed her lips to his through the veil, drawing toward her his head at the same time, till at last breath failed the woman and she tore her face from him. "Night of love, night of madness," said she, catching the air quickly. "Today is free. Thou hast me." But that kiss burned Vinicius. It filled him with disquiet. His soul and heart were elsewhere. In the whole world nothing existed for him except Lygia. So, pushing back the veiled figure, he said, "Whoever thou be, I love another. I do not wish thee." "Remove the veil," said she, lowering her head toward him. At that moment the leaves of the nearest myrtle began to rustle, The veiled woman vanished like a dream vision, but from a distance her laugh was heard, strange in some way, and ominous. Petronius stood before Vinicius. "I have heard and seen," said he. "Let us go from this place," replied Vinicius. And they went. They passed the Eupane area gleaming with light, the grove, the line of mounted praetorians, and found the litters. "I will go with thee," said Petronius. They sat down together. On the road both were silent, and only in the atrium of Vinicius's house did Petronius ask, "Dost thou know who it was?" "Was it Rubria?" asked Vinicius, repulsed at the very thought that Rubria was a Vestal. "No." "Who then?" Petronius lowered his voice. "The fire of Vesta was defiled, for Rubria was with Caesar." "But with thee was speaking," and he finished in a still lower voice, "the divine Augusta." A moment of silence followed. "Caesar," said Petronius, "was unable to hide from Poppaea his desire for Rubria, therefore she wished, perhaps, to avenge herself. But I hindered you both. Hadst thou recognized the Augusta and refused her, thou wouldst have been ruined beyond rescue, thou, Lygia, and I, perhaps. I have enough of Rome, Caesar, feasts, the Augusta, Tigellinus, and all of you," burst out Vinicius. "I am stifling. I cannot live thus. I cannot." "Dost understand me?" "Vinicius, thou art losing sense, judgment, moderation." "I love only her in this world." "What of that?" "This, that I wish no other love." "I have no wish for your life, your feasts, your shamelessness, your crimes." "What is taking place in thee?" "Art thou a Christian?" The young man seized his head with both hands, and repeated, as if in despair, "Not yet." "Not yet." Chapter 32. Petronius went home shrugging his shoulders and greatly dissatisfied. It was evident to him that he and Vinicius had ceased to understand each other, that their souls had separated entirely. Once Petronius had immense influence over the young soldier. He had been for him a model in everything, and frequently a few ironical words of his sufficed to restrain Vinicius or urge him to something. At present there remained nothing of that. Such was the change that Petronius did not try his former methods, feeling that his wit and irony would slip without effect along the new principles which love and contact with the uncomprehended society of Christians had put in the soul of Vinicius. The veteran skeptic understood that he had lost the key to that soul. This knowledge filled him with dissatisfaction and even with fear, which was heightened by the events of that night. "If on the part of the Augusta it is not a passing whim but a more enduring desire," thought Petronius, "one of two things will happen. Either Vinicius will not resist her, and he may be ruined by any accident, or, what is like him today, he will resist, and in that event he will be ruined certainly, and perhaps I with him, even because I am his relative, and because the Augusta, having included a whole family in her hatred, will throw the weight of her influence on the side of Tigellinus. In this way, and that it is bad." Petronius was a man of courage and felt no dread of death, but since he hoped nothing from it, he had no wish to invite it. After long meditation, he decided at last that it would be better and safer to send Vinicius from Rome on a journey. But if in addition he could give him Ligia for the road, he would do so with pleasure. But he hoped that it would not be too difficult to persuade him to the journey without her. He would spread a report on the Palatine then of Vinicius's illness, and remove danger as well from his nephew as himself. The Augusta did not know whether she was recognized by Vinicius. She might suppose that she was not, hence her vanity had not suffered much so far. But it might be different in the future, and it was necessary to avoid peril. Petronius wished to gain time, above all, for he understood that once Caesar set out for Achaea, Tigellinus, who comprehended nothing in the domain of art, would descend to the second place and lose his influence. In Greece Petronius was sure of victory over every opponent. Meanwhile he determined to watch over Vinicius, and urge him to the journey. For a number of days he was ever thinking over this, that if he obtained an edict from Caesar expelling the Christians from Rome, Lygia would leave it with the other confessors of Christ, and after her Vinicius too. Then there would be no need to persuade him. The thing itself was possible. In fact, it was not so long since, when the Jews began disturbances out of hatred of the Christians, Claudius, unable to distinguish one from the other, expelled the Jews. Why should not Nero expel the Christians? There would be more room in Rome without them. After that floating feast Petronius saw Nero daily, both on the Palatine and in other houses. To suggest such an idea was easy, for Nero never opposed suggestions which brought harm or ruin to anyone. After matured decision, Petronius framed a whole plan for himself. He would prepare a feast in his own house, and at this feast persuade Caesar to issue an edict. He had even a hope, which was not barren, that Caesar would confide the execution of the edict to him. He would send out Lygia with all the consideration proper to the mistress of Vinicius to buy, for instance, and let them love and amuse themselves there with Christianity as much as they liked. Meanwhile he visited Vinicius frequently, first, because he could not, despite all his Roman selfishness, rid himself of attachment to the young tribune, and second, because he wished to persuade him to the journey. Vinicius feigned sickness, and did not show himself on the Palatine, where new plans appeared every day. At last Petronius heard from the Caesar's own lips that 3 days from then he would go to Antium without fail. Next morning he went straight away to inform Vinicius, who showed him a list of persons invited to Antium, which list one of Caesar's freedmen had brought him that morning. "My name is on it, so is thine," said he. "Thou wilt find the same at thy house on returning." "Were I not among the invited," replied Petronius, "it would mean that I must die. I do not expect that to happen before the journey to Achaia. I shall be too useful to Nero." "Barely have we come to Rome," said he, on looking at the list, "when we must leave again, and drag over the road to Antium. But we must go, for this is not merely an invitation, it is a command as well. And if someone would not obey, he would be invited in another style to go on a journey notably longer, one from which people do not return. What a pity that thou hast not obeyed my counsel and left Rome in season. Now thou must go to Antium." "I must go to Antium. See in what times we live and what vile slaves we are. Hast thou noticed that only today?" "No, but thou hast explained to me that Christian teaching is an enemy of life, since it shackles it." "But can their shackles be stronger than those which we carry?" "Thou hast said, Greece created wisdom and beauty, and Rome power. Where is our power?" "Call Shiloh and talk with him." "I have no desire today to philosophize." "By Hercules, I did not create these times, and I do not answer for them." "Let us speak of Antium." "Know that great danger is awaiting thee, and it would be better, perhaps, to measure strength with that Ursus who choked Croton than to go there, but still thou canst not refuse." Vinicius waved his hand carelessly, and said, "Danger. We are all wandering in the shadow of death, and every moment some head sinks in its darkness." Am I to enumerate all who had a little sense, and therefore, in spite of the times of Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero, lived 80 and 90 years? Let even such a man as Domitius offer serve thee as an example. He has grown old quietly, though all his life he has been a criminal and a villain. "Perhaps for that very reason," answered Vinicius. Then he began to glance over the list and read, "Tigellinus, Vadinius, Sextus Africanus, Aquilinus Regulus, Silius Nerulnus, Eprius Marcellus," and so on. What an assembly of ruffians and scoundrels! And to say that they govern the world. Would it not become them better to exhibit an Egyptian or Syrian divinity through villages, jingle sistra, and earn their bread by telling fortunes or dancing? Or exhibiting learned monkeys, calculating dogs, or a flute-playing ass, added Petronius. "That is true, but let us speak of something more important. Summon thy attention and listen. I have said on the Palatine that thou art ill, unable to leave the house. Still thy name is on the list, which proves that someone does not credit my stories and has seen to this purposely. Nero cares nothing for the matter, since for him thou art a soldier, who has no conception of poetry or music, and with whom at the very highest he can talk only about races in the circus. So Poppaea must have seemed to putting down thy name, which means that her desire for thee was not a passing whim, and that she wants to win thee. She is a daring Augusta. Indeed she is daring, for she may ruin herself beyond redemption. May Venus inspire her, however, with another love as soon as possible. But since she desires thee thou must observe the very greatest caution. She has begun to weary Bronzebeard already. He prefers Rubria now, or Pythagoras, but, through consideration of self, he would wreak the most horrible vengeance on us. In the grove I knew not that she was speaking to me, but thou wert listening. I said that I loved another, and did not wish her. Thou knowest that. I implore thee, by all the infernal gods, lose not the remnant of reason which the Christians have left in thee. How is it possible to hesitate, having a choice between probable and certain destruction. Have I not said already that if thou hadst wounded the Augustus vanity, there would have been no rescue for thee? By Hades, if life has grown hateful to thee, better open thy veins at once, or cast thyself on a sword, for shouldst thou offend Poppaea, a less easy death may meet thee. It was easier once to converse with thee. What concerns thee specially? Would this affair cause thee loss, or hinder thee from loving thy Lygia? Remember, besides, that Poppaea saw her on the Palatine. It will not be difficult for her to guess why thou art rejecting such lofty favor, and she will get Lygia even from under the earth. Thou wilt ruin not only thyself, but Lygia too. Dost understand? Vinicius listened as if thinking of something else, and at last he said, I must see her. Who? Lygia. Lygia. Dost thou know where she is? No. Then thou wilt begin anew to search for her in old cemeteries and beyond the Tiber? I know not, but I must see her. Well, though she is a Christian, it may turn out that she has more judgment than thou, and it will certainly, unless she wishes thy ruin. Vinicius shrugged his shoulders. She saved me from the hands of Ursus. Then hurry, for Bronzebeard will not postpone his departure. Sentences of death may be issued in Antium also. But Vinicius did not hear. One thought alone occupied him, an interview with Lygia. Hence he began to think over methods. Meanwhile something intervened which might set aside every difficulty. Shiloh came to his house unexpectedly. He entered wretched and worn, with signs of hunger on his face and in rags, but the servants, who had the former command to admit him at all hours of the day or night, did not dare to detain him. So he went straight to the atrium, and standing before Vinicius said, May the gods give thee immortality, and share with thee dominion over the world. Vinicius at the first moment wished to give the order to throw him out of doors, but the thought came to him that the Greek perhaps knew something of Lygia, and curiosity overcame his disgust. Is that thou? Asked he. What has happened to thee? Evil, O sons of Jove, answered Shiloh. Real virtue is a ware for which no one inquires now, and a genuine sage must be glad of this even, that once in 5 days he has something with which to buy from the butcher a sheep's head, to gnaw in a garret, washing it down with his tears. Ah, Lord! What thou didst give me I paid Atractus for books, and afterward I was robbed and ruined. The slave who was to write down my wisdom fled, taking the remnant of what thy generosity bestowed on me. I am in misery, but I thought to myself, to whom can I go, if not to thee, O Serapis, whom I love and deify, for whom I have exposed my life? Why hast thou come, and what dost thou bring? I come for aid, O Baal, and I bring my misery, my tears, my love, and finally the information which through love for thee I have collected. Thou rememberest, Lord, I told thee once how I had given a slave of the divine Petronius one thread from the girdle of the Paphian Venus. I know now that it helped her, and thou, O descendant of the sun, who knowest what is happening in that house, knowest also what Eunice is there. I have another such thread. I have preserved it for thee, Lord. Here he stopped, on noticing the anger which was gathering on the brows of Vinicius, and said quickly, so as to anticipate the outburst, I know where the divine Lygia is living. I will show thee the street and the house. Vinicius repressed the emotion with which that news filled him, and said, Where is she? With Linus, the elder priest of the Christians. She is there with Ursus, who goes as before to the miller, a namesake of thy dispensator Demas. Yes, Demas. Ursus works in the night, so if thou surround the house at night, thou wilt not find him. Linus is old, and besides him there are only 2 aged women in the house. Whence dost thou know all this? Thou rememberest, Lord, that the Christians had me in their hands, and spared me. True, Glaucus was mistaken in thinking that I was the cause of his misfortunes, but he believed that I was, poor man, and he believes so yet. Still they spared me. Then be not astonished, Lord, that gratitude filled my heart. I am a man of former, of better times. This was my thought. Am I to desert friends and benefactors? Would I not have been hard-hearted not to inquire about them, not to learn what was happening to them, how health was serving them, and where they were living? By the Passinian Sibylle, I am not capable of such conduct. At first I was restrained by fear that they might interpret my wishes incorrectly. But the love which I bore them proved greater than my fear, and the ease with which they forgive every injustice lent me special courage. But above all I was thinking of thee, Lord. Our last attempt ended in defeat, but can such a son of fortune be reconciled with defeat? So I prepared victory for thee. The house stands apart. Thou mayst give command to thy slaves to surround it so that not a mouse could escape. My lord, on thee alone it depends to have that magnanimous king's daughter in thy house this very night. But should that happen, remember that the cause of it is the very poor and hungry son of my father. The blood rushed to Vinicius's head. Temptation shook all his being again. Yes, that was the method, and this time a certain one. Once he has Lygia in his house, who can take her? Once he makes Lygia his mistress, what will be left to her, unless to remain so forever? And let all religions perish. What will the Christians mean to him then, with their mercy and forbidding faith? Is it not time to shake himself free of all that? Is it not time to live as all live? What will Lygia do later, save to reconcile her fate with the religion which she professes? That, too, is a question of inferior significance. Those are matters devoid of importance. First of all, she will be his, and his this very day, and it is a question, too, whether that religion will hold out in her soul against the world which is new to her, against luxury and excitements to which she must yield. All may happen today. He needs only to detain Shiloh, and give an order at dark, and then delight without end. What has my life been, thought Vinicius, suffering, unsatisfied desire, and an endless propounding of problems without answer. In this way all will be cut short and ended. He recollected, it is true, that he had promised not to raise a hand against her. But by what had he sworn? Not by the gods, for he did not believe in them, not by Christ, for he did not believe in him yet. Finally, if she feels injured, he will marry her, and thus repair the wrong. Yes, to that he feels bound, for to her he is indebted for life. Here he recalled the day in which with Croton he had attacked her retreat. He remembered the Lygian's fist raised above him, and all that had happened later. He saw her again bent over his couch, dressed in the garb of a slave, beautiful as a divinity, a benefactress kind and glorified. His eyes passed to the Lorarium unconsciously, and to the little cross which she left him before going. Will he pay for all that by a new attack? Will he drag her by the hair as a slave to his cubiculum? And how will he be able to do so, since he not only desires but loves her, and he loves her specially because she is as she is? All at once he felt that it was not enough for him to have her in the house. It was not enough to seize her in his arms by superior force. He felt that his love needed something more, her consent, her loves and her soul. Blessed that roof, if she come under it willingly, blessed the moment, blessed the day, blessed his life. Then the happiness of both will be as inexhaustible as the ocean, as the sun. But to seize her by violence would be to destroy that happiness forever, and at the same time to destroy and defile that which is most precious and alone beloved in life. Terror seized him now at the very thought of this. He glanced at Shiloh, who, while watching him, pushed his hands under his rags and scratched himself uneasily. That instant, disgust unspeakable took possession of Vinicius, and a wish to trample that former assistant of his, as he would a foul or more venomous serpent. In an instant he knew what to do. But knowing no measure in anything, and following the impulse of his stern Roman nature, he turned toward Shiloh and said, I will not do what thou advisest, but, lest thou go without just reward, I will command to give thee 300 stripes in the domestic prison. Shiloh grew pale. There was so much cold resolution in the beautiful face of Vinicius that he could not deceive himself for a moment with the hope that the promised reward was no more than a cruel jest. Hence he threw himself on his knees in one instant, and bending double began to groan in a broken voice. How, O King of Persia? Why? O Pyramid of kindness, Colossus of mercy? For what? I am old, hungry, unfortunate. I have served thee. Dost thou repay in this manner? As thou didst the Christians, said Vinicius. And he called the dispensator. But Shiloh sprang toward his feet, and, embracing them convulsively, talked, while his face was covered with deathly pallor. O Lord, I am old. 50, not 300 stripes. 50 are enough. 100, not 300. Oh, mercy, mercy. Vinicius thrust him away with his foot, and gave the order. In the twinkle of an eye too powerful Quo Vadis followed the dispensator, and, seizing Shiloh by the remnant of his hair, tied his own rags around his neck and dragged him to the prison. In the name of Christ, called the Greek, At the exit of the corridor, Vinicius was left alone. The order just issued roused and enlivened him. He endeavored to collect his scattered thoughts, and bring them to order. He felt great relief, and the victory which he had gained over himself filled him with comfort. He thought that he had made some great approach toward Lygia, and that some high reward should be given him. At the first moment it did not even occur to him that he had done a grievous wrong to Shiloh, and had him flogged for the very acts for which he had rewarded him previously. He was too much of a Roman yet to be pained by another man's suffering, and to occupy his attention with one wretched Greek. Had he even thought of Shiloh's suffering he would have considered that he had acted properly in giving command to punish such a villain. But he was thinking of Lygia, and said to her, I will not pay thee with evil for good, and when thou shalt learn how I acted with him who strove to persuade me to raise hands against thee, thou wilt be grateful. But here he stopped at this thought. Would Lygia praise his treatment of Shiloh? The religion which she professes commands forgiveness. Nay, the Christians forgave the villain, though they had greater reasons for revenge. Then for the first time was heard in his soul the cry, in the name of Christ. He remembered then that Shiloh had ransomed himself from the hands of Ursus with such a cry, and he determined to remit the remainder of the punishment. With that object he was going to summon the dispensator, when that person stood before him, and said, Lord, the old man has fainted, and perhaps he is dead. Am I to command further flogging? Revive him and bring him before me. The chief of the atrium vanished behind the curtain, but the revival could not have been easy, for Vinicius waited a long time and was growing impatient, when the slaves brought in Shiloh, and disappeared at a signal. Shiloh was as pale as linen, and down his legs threads of blood were flowing to the mosaic pavement of the atrium. He was conscious, however, and, falling on his knees, began to speak, with extended hands, Thanks to thee, Lord. Thou art great and merciful. Dog, said Vinicius, know that I forgave thee because of that Christ to whom I owe my own life. O Lord, I will serve him and thee. Be silent and listen. Rise. Thou wilt go and show me the house in which Lygia dwells. Shiloh sprang up, but he was barely on his feet when he grew more deathly pale yet, and said in a failing voice, Lord, I am really hungry. I will go. Lord, I will go. But I have not the strength. Command to give me even remnants from the plate of thy dog, and I will go. Vinicius commanded to give him food, a piece of gold, and a mantle. But Shiloh, weakened by stripes and hunger, could not go to take food, though terror raised the hair on his head, lest Vinicius might mistake his weakness for stubbornness and command to flog him anew. Only let wine warm me, repeated he, with chattering teeth. I shall be able to go at once, even to Magna Graecia. He regained some strength after a time, and they went out. The way was long, for, like the majority of Christians, Linus dwelt in the Trans-Tiber, and not far from Miriam. At last Shiloh showed Vinicius a small house, standing apart, surrounded by a wall covered entirely with ivy, and said, Here it is, Lord. Well, said Vinicius, go thy way now, but listen first to what I tell thee. Forget that thou hast served me, forget where Miriam, Peter, and Glaucus dwell, forget also this house, and all Christians. Thou wilt come every month to my house, where Demas, my freedman, will pay thee 2 pieces of gold. But shouldst thou spy further after Christians, I will have thee flogged, or delivered into the hands of the prefect of the city. Shiloh bowed down, and said, I will forget. But when Vinicius vanished beyond the corner of the street, he stretched his hands after him, and, threatening with his fists, exclaimed, By 8 and the Furies, I will not forget. Then he grew faint again. Chapter 33. Vinicius went directly to the house in which Miriam lived. Before the gate he met Nazarius, who was confused at sight of him, but greeting the lad cordially, he asked to be conducted to his mother's lodgings. Besides Miriam, Vinicius found Peter, Glaucus, Crispus, and Paul of Tarsus, who had returned recently from Phrygia. At sight of the young tribune, astonishment was reflected on all faces, but he said, I greet you in the name of Christ, whom ye honor. May his name be glorified forever. Answered they, I have seen your virtue and experienced your kindness, hence I come as a friend. And we greet thee as a friend, answered Peter. Sit down, Lord, and partake of our refreshment. As a guest, I will sit down and share your repast, but first listen to me. thou Peter, and thou Paul of Tarsus, so that ye may know my sincerity. I know where Lygia is. I have returned from before the house of Linus, which is near this dwelling. I have a right to her given me by Caesar. I have at my houses in the city nearly 500 slaves. I might surround her hiding place and seize her, still I have not done so, and will not. For this reason the blessing of the Lord will be upon thee, and thy heart will be purified, said Peter. I thank thee. But listen to me further. I have not done so, though I am living in suffering and sadness. Before I knew you, I should have taken her undoubtedly, and held her by force. But your virtue and your religion, though I do not profess it, have changed something in my soul, so that I do not venture on violence. I know not myself why this is so, but it is so, hence I come to you, for ye take the place of Lygia's father and mother, and I say to you, give her to me as wife, and I swear that not only will I not forbid her to confess Christ, but I will begin myself to learn his religion. He spoke with head erect and decisively, but still he was moved, and his legs trembled beneath his mantle. When silence followed his words, he continued, as if wishing to anticipate an unfavorable answer, I know what obstacles exist, but I love her as my own eyes, and though I am not a Christian yet, I am neither your enemy nor Christ's. I wish to be sincere, so that you may trust me. At this moment it is a question of life with me, still I tell you the truth. Another might say, baptize me. I say, enlighten me. I believe that Christ rose from the dead, for people say so who love the truth, and who saw him after death. I believe, for I have seen myself, that your religion produces virtue, justice, and mercy, not crime, which is laid to your charge. I have not known your religion much so far. A little from you, a little from your works, a little from Lygia, a little from conversations with you. Still I repeat that it has made some change in me. Formerly I held my servants with an iron hand. I cannot do so now. I knew no pity. I know it now. I was fond of pleasure. The other night I fled from the pond of Agrippa, for the breath was taken from me through disgust. Formerly I believed in superior force. Now I have abandoned it. Know ye that I do not recognize myself. I am disgusted by feasts, wine, singing, stare, garlands, the court of Caesar, naked bodies, and every crime. When I think that Lygia is like snow in the mountains, I love her the more, and when I think that she is what she is through your religion, I love and desire that religion. But since I understand it not, since I know not whether I shall be able to live according to it, nor whether my nature can endure it, I am in uncertainty and suffering, as if I were in prison. Here his brows met in wrinkle of pain, and a flush appeared on his cheeks. After that he spoke on with growing haste and greater emotion, As ye see, I am tortured from love and uncertainty. Men tell me that in your religion there is no place for life, or human joy, or happiness, or law, or order, or authority, or Roman dominion. Is this true? Men tell me that ye are madmen. But tell me yourselves what ye bring. Is it a sin to love, a sin to feel joy, a sin to want happiness? Are ye enemies of life? Must a Christian be wretched? Must I renounce Lygia? What is truth in your view? Your deeds and words are like transparent water, but what is under that water? Ye see that I am sincere. Scatter the darkness. Men say this to me also. Greece created beauty and wisdom, Rome created power, but what do they bring? Tell, then, what ye bring. If there is brightness beyond your doors, open them. We bring love, said Peter. And Paul of Tarsus added, if I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am become sounding brass. But the heart of the old apostle was stirred by that soul in suffering, which, like a bird in a cage, was struggling toward air and the sun. Hence, stretching his hand to Vinicius, he said, whoso knocketh, to him will be opened. The favor and grace of God is upon thee. For this reason I bless thee, thy soul and thy love, in the name of the Redeemer of mankind. Vinicius, who had spoken with enthusiasm already, sprang toward Peter on hearing this blessing, and an uncommon thing happened. That descendant of Quirites, who till recently had not recognized humanity in a foreigner, seized the hand of the old Galilean, and pressed it in gratitude to his lips. Peter was pleased, for he understood that his sowing had fallen on an additional field, that his fishing net had gathered in a new soul. Those present, not less pleased by that evident expression of honor for the apostle of God, exclaimed in one voice, Praise to the Lord in the highest. Vinicius rose with a radiant face, and began, I see that happiness may dwell among you, for I feel happy, and I think that ye can convince me of other things in the same way. But I will add that this cannot happen in Rome. Caesar is going to Antioch and I must go with him, for I have the order. Ye know that not to obey is death. But if I have found favor in your eyes, go with me to teach your truth. It will be safer for you than for me. Even in that great throng of people, ye can announce your truth in the very court of Caesar. They say that Octave is a Christian, and there are Christians among praetorians even, for I myself have seen soldiers kneeling before thee, Peter, at the Nomentan gate. In Anthium I have a villa where we shall assemble to hear your teaching, at the side of Nero. Glaucus told me that ye are ready to go to the end of the earth for one soul. So do for me what ye have done for those for whose sake ye have come from Judea. Do it, and desert not my soul. Hearing this, they began to take counsel, thinking with delight of the victory of their religion, and of the significance for the pagan world which the conversion of an Augustine, and a descendant of one of the oldest Roman families, would have. They were ready, indeed, to wander to the end of the earth for one human soul, and since the death of the Master they had, in fact, done nothing else. Hence a negative answer did not even come to their minds. Peter was at that moment the pastor of a whole multitude, hence he could not go, but Paul of Tarsus, who had been in Aricium and Phrygia not long before, and who was preparing for a long journey to the east to visit churches there and freshen them with a new spirit of zeal, consented to accompany the young tribune to Antium. It was easy to find the ship there going to Grecian waters. Vinicius, though sad because Peter, to whom he owed so much, could not visit Antium, thanked him with gratitude, and then turned to the old apostle with his last request. Knowing Lygia's dwelling, said he, I might have gone to her and asked, as is proper, whether she would take me as husband should my soul become Christian, but I prefer to ask thee, O apostle, permit me to see her, or take me thyself to her. I know not how long I shall be in Antium. And remember that near Caesar no one is sure of tomorrow. Petronius himself told me that I should not be altogether safe there. Let me see her before I go, let me delight my eyes with her, and let me ask her if she will forget my evil and return good. Peter smiled kindly and said, but who could refuse thee a proper joy, my son? Vinicius stooped again to Peter's hands, for he could not in any way restrain his overflowing heart. The apostle took him by the temples and said, have no fear of Caesar. For I tell thee that a hair will not fall from thy head. He sent Miriam for Lygia, telling her not to say who was with them, so as to give the maiden more delight. It was not far, so after a short time those in the chamber saw among the myrtles of the garden Miriam leading Lygia by the hand. Vinicius wished to run forth to meet her, but at sight of that beloved form happiness took his strength, and he stood with beating heart, breathless, barely able to keep his feet. 100 times more excited than when for the first time in life he heard the Parthian arrows whizzing round his head. She ran in, unsuspecting, but at sight of him she halted as if fixed to the earth. Her face flushed, and then became very pale. She looked with astonished and frightened eyes on those present. But round about she saw clear glances, full of kindness. The apostle Peter approached her and asked, Lygia, dost thou love him as ever? A moment of silence followed. Her lips began to quiver like those of a child who is preparing to cry, who feels that it is guilty, but sees that it must confess the guilt. Answer, said the apostle. Then, with humility, obedience, and fear in her voice, she whispered, kneeling at the knees of Peter, I do. In one moment Vinicius knelt at her side. Peter placed his hands on their heads, and said, love each other in the Lord and to his glory, for there is no sin in your love.